The title of this presentation is Solar Maximum and links to cycles of war, changes in society, societal change, and personal transformation of consciousness. And there's a number of individuals that I would like to acknowledge that have done tremendous research in this particular subject, such as Alexander Chavinsky, Raymond Wheeler, Dr. Burryl Payne, Mitch Batros, Alfred Weber, who's speaking at this conference, Maurice Cottrell, Carol Moore, and the website spaceweather.com. So we're going to be talking about some of the changes taking place with the sun. As some of you already know, the History Channel for years, as we've been approaching 2012, has been presenting the changes with the sun, the cycles of the sun, as something that may end the world as we know it, which has created a lot of misunderstanding as to what changes the cycle actually brings. We're going to talk about the changes that the cycle of the sun brings in terms of climate, cycles of war, changes in consciousness, and even changes within the economy itself. So by looking at the cycles of the sun, we can get out of what a lot of people are stuck in, which is a polarized worldview. A perception that, A, we are going to have a global shift in consciousness, which assumes that everyone's going to wake up. And the other polarized worldview is catastrophobia. We see a lot of this during solar peaks. Perceptions that the end is near, either in terms of Earth changes or a belief that the systems of control will be successful in all their attempts to control this planet. And this view is out of alignment with free will for those that are choosing to activate the higher consciousness. This view has no room for miracles, and this view that they're going to win puts the New World Order at a creator level, which is not the most mindful thing to do. Both of these views that a lot of people are emotionally attached to, their hopes, their fears, is ultimately based in Western linear thinking. In the East, circular thinking has no beginning and no end. So we're not talking about complete salvation, and we're not talking about total damnation. We're simply looking at the cycles and the change that they bring. In 2009, I published an article entitled Solar Cycles and the Earth's Weakening Magnetic Field, which was published in NEXUS magazine in their spring 2009 edition. And the following is a brief breakdown of some of the info that I was looking at then in 2009 that's going to set the preface for some of the other information that we'll be getting into. And this is a graph, one of many, that shows the solar cycles, and this one starts at 1940. That was their projection for what Sunspot Cycle 24 was expected to be several years ago. That has changed since then. Solar Cycle 24 was originally projected to be 30 to 50% stronger than the previous cycle, which began as much as a year late. And there's been a delay in the intensity of the rise, leading some to speculate that we may be going into a deep minimum, which could trigger a mini ice age, and others to speculate that in fact this is actually the quiet before the storm. In 2008 and 2009, because of record low sunspot numbers, solar wind dropped to a 50-year low. And right now, NASA is predicting that the solar cycle is not going to peak in May 2013, which was their last projection, but in fact, we're going to see a double peak in late 2013 and 2015. A lot like what we saw in Solar Cycle 14 about 100 years ago at the turn of the century. The last two solar cycles, we saw a double peak in Sunspot Cycle number 22 and Sunspot Cycle number 23. This is what Mitch Batros has to say about this on Coast to Coast, November 22nd, 2012. There seems to be a change in the configuration that these lower events, such as an M1 or M5, seems to have the impact of an X-flare. That correlation is transferring to the Earth's core, and that's what's causing these Earth-changing events, such as earthquakes and volcanoes, including hurricanes and extreme weather of all types. Here's what NASSIM HARAMEIN has to say. When we passed the galactic equator, I realized that this may be where the ancient Mayans and the solar calendar were describing that there was going to be an energy increase, an energy event in our solar system, resulting from our relationship to the galactic center, and that when we crossed the galactic equator, we would get bombarded with more cosmic rays that would activate the plasma dynamic of our sun, and that the sun may go through a larger cycle in which, in that moment, it gets hotter and more active than it was when we were not going through the galactic equator. So NASA's been very public about their concern that their Tower of Babel may be about to collapse. A repeat of the 1859 Carnarvon event, where the grid went down on September 1st and 2nd, the grid that did exist at that time. The nation's telegraph wire system went black after our planet was hit with a massive solar flare that made its way to the Earth in 17.6 hours. Normally, CMEs take 3 to 4 days to reach the Earth, but because of a prior flare, it cleared the way of ambient solar plasma, and this could happen again. In that event, auroras were seen around the world, even as far south as the Caribbean. So there's been a number of studies on this potential event of the grid being disrupted, and there's a general consensus that if this would happen, there'd be a catastrophe, there'd be food shortages, there would be mass deaths. And this is only one way of looking at this particular event and outcome or reality. There could be positive in results of such an event, but they're warning that vital systems like nuclear power plants and some aspects of the military-industrial complex could be affected. And they've estimated that this could cost about $2 trillion, which I think is a highly conservative number. These are dense population centers. If we did see a massive solar flare take out the grid, the area would be the most affected by such an event. Now, the problem with the nuclear power plants is that there's not enough fuel to run the backup generators if cooling systems would be affected. And Congress has taken no action. House of Reps try to push the Senate to create redundancy systems. And in the bill they proposed, H.R. 5026, they remove all references to protecting the power grid. So even though they gave the bankster gangsters trillions of dollars in a banker bailout, the estimated cost to reinforce the grid is only about $100 million. Which leads me to wonder if they're aware that something's coming that they can't stop, that they need to be prepared for, to deal with, to manage in a way that doesn't involve worrying about the American people and what they're going to do. So we should ask ourselves some questions. Is there a fear at the higher echelons of, say, even the shadow government, that they're concerned that their Tower of Babel could be on the brink of collapse, total destruction? Has at any time this government discovered this potential of this event with the use of remote viewing or any other means? And in what specific ways are they preparing for this event? How do they intend to maintain a strong, dominant, controlling position when their technology that's often used to suppress humanity is disrupted? How might this create a positive outcome after a period of time of people seeking freedoms, for people seeking freedom from dominating structures and oppressive systems at a moment when governments may not possess the technology or resources to continue to suppress them or manipulate them? And of course, how might such an event bring people together in a crisis where friends and loved ones are more valuable than money or technology? So I've been speculating for years in my own inner imagination that an event like this could really bring a shift in consciousness, because all of a sudden, we're now more valuable to each other. And the matrix, technology, money as we know it, it will be less and less valuable. So is this really the end, as the History Channel has been drumming into people's minds, as we have been going into 2012, ramping up the years into 2012? Or could this be the beginning of something entirely new? There's been a lot of events where technology has already been disrupted by increased solar flares, such as 1960 and in 1989, where the grid went down in Canada, and 6 million people in the US and Canada were left without power for 9 hours. And in 1993, ATM machines were affected in Massachusetts. In 2003, a series of X-class flares interfered with satellite communications and created a brief power outage in Sweden and lit up the skies with ghostly auroras as far south as Florida and Texas. You'll notice there, September 7, 2005, with this event, that was right around the time of Hurricane Katrina. And that event, around that time period, an X-class flare caused disruptions to parts of the grid and knocked out the GPS system completely for 10 minutes. And I know some people aren't aware of this stuff, but all this stuff is scientifically verified, and you can look it up on the internet. And the last several years, more satellites that have been owned and managed by the U.S. military have faced some form of disruption have been affected in some way. There aren't a whole lot of ways that NASA can completely accurately project the intensity of an upcoming solar cycle or the amount of sunspots, but one of the things that they look at is the sun's great conveyor belt, or GCB. And what's interesting is their calculations in 2006 have changed. In 2006, NASA solar physicist David Hathaway said that a previous study of the GCB showed a slowdown, and said that based on current data, the slowdown we're now seeing means that solar cycle 25, the next cycle, peaking around 2022, could be one of the weakest in centuries. But in 2009, when we saw low sunspots and the sun's great conveyor belt was speeding up, he realized that his calculations was completely wrong. And what this means is that in 2022, we can have an even more intense cycle, even more solar flares, even more sunspots than what we're seeing in this cycle, sunspot cycle 24. And this is a quote from David Hathaway from NASA. This challenges existing models of the solar cycle and has forced us back to the drawing board for new ideas. So the magnetic field, as you know, protects us from asteroids, different forms of radiation, some of which is harmful. And when solar flares hit the magnetic field, it diverts the solar particles towards the poles. And so a strong magnetic field is obviously a very good thing for life on Earth. And there's been lots of reports suggesting that the magnetic field is changing on the planet, and in fact, it's weakening. And within 500 years, we could be left without a magnetic field at the rate that it's shifting. NASA's 5 Themis satellites have also detected holes in the Earth's magnetic field. Holes 10 times larger than anything previously thought to exist. The invisible portals form every 8 minutes, and they rapidly change location, making them difficult to track. So the breach that we're seeing with the Earth's magnetic field can maximize the impact on the solar flares, and of course the human emotional response, as we'll get into. NASA is really concerned because the Earth and the Sun's magnetic fields will be in sync at the peak of this current solar cycle, which they have already said could result in a shields down situation. This story has also been referred to as magnetic portals connect the Sun and the Earth. And this is a NASA illustration of the breach. You've probably also heard about magnetic north moving at 40 miles per year in the direction of Russia. And this has already begun to cause major problems for aviation. They've already recalibrated landing strips at airports across the nation and the planet. And this can also cause issues for migratory animals and birds, leading some to speculate that maybe the die-off that we've seen with the birds, with the honeybees, with the fish, is not a result of deliberate chemical poisoning, but their navigation systems being off to the point where they're ending up in cold waters or cold parts of the planet where they can no longer survive. So this field we're discussing has been decreasing for at least 160 years at an alarming rate, leading some experts to speculate that we could be heading towards a reversal. And that happens when patches of iron atoms in the Earth's liquid outer core become reverse aligned. And they're finding evidence that we are seeing rapid changes in the Earth's liquid core. The study suggests from the National Academy of Scientists that the churning movement of the Earth's liquid core is weakening the field of the planet in some regions of the planet areas around the Atlantic and Pacific Ocean. Scientists have also detected that every now and then our magnetic field is bombarded with cosmic rays from space. And for years they didn't know where cosmic rays came from, and now they're saying they believe that they are caused by supernovas, explosions, remnants of stars. And several months ago, a report came out that scientists are looking at new clues that our universe may be a holographic reality, a computer simulation. And specifically, they're looking at cosmic rays and their equation, which makes this even more interesting. So there's been a number of other anomalies. I'm going to try to speed this up to get to the next section. Missing matter caught in tangled cosmic webs. Magnetic fields offer black hole escape route. And this relates to the Earth itself, may be a living conscious being responding to the solar flares. This is from the Daily Mail, on June 1st, 2012. Last month's solar flare created a mysterious pulse on Earth that seemed to answer the sun's blast. So there's been a lot of changes in our solar system, the new discoveries that indicates that the world as we know it, the universe as we know it, is changing very, very fast. For example, water ice has been discovered on Mercury. New storm on Jupiter hints at climate change. Pluto's atmosphere larger than thought. Dark side of Uranus rings reveals dramatic changes. NASA's Cassini satellite sees abrupt turn in Titan's atmosphere. That's one of Saturn's moons. And Saturn, by the way, there's been a lot of storms that have been recorded on the surface of that planet over the course of the last decade. NASA's spacecraft reveals dramatic changes in the atmosphere of Mars. Strongest evidence yet that there is life on Mars. Bizarre vortex on Venus changes shape every day. By the way, this is from space.com. And they're also detecting changes in Venus, changes in the ionosphere of Venus. And this came out on the 20th of April of just this year. 7 new planets have been found. 2 of them may sustain life. There's obviously a lot of changes taking place within the solar system, but the focus of this presentation, and all that was the preface for what we'll get into now, is how human beings are affected by these changes. Emotional states. Pattern recognition is what we're looking at here with the connection between peaks in solar cycles, solar activities, times of solar maximum, and the launching of new battles, wars, conflicts, false flag events, specifically at certain times. And we're going to be looking at a number of individuals that have provided information about the quantitative information that everybody has access to in terms of these solar cycles. And Alexander Chavinsky is one of the most historical figures. He was an acclaimed scientist in Russia who studied the biological effects of the sun and universe. In particular, how mouse changes in human behavior correlated to sunspot cycles. In 1915, he started to look in this direction at the effects of the sun. He spent a summer observing the sun and first hypothesized the effect of periodic changes in solar activity on the organic world. In 1916, he entered the front lines of World War I, and it was there that he first discovered that battles tended to wax and wane with the strength of solar flares and geomagnetic storms. He constructed what's called the Index of Mass Human Excitability, which traced the incidence of wars, revolutions, riots, expeditions, and migrations from 500 BC to 1922 AD. And he was jailed for his research by Stalin in 1942. He asked Chavatsky to retract his writings in solar cycles, which contradicted Soviet theories of the reasons for the Russian revolutions of 1905 and 1917. So he did 8 years in a forced labor gulag, followed by 8 years of Soviet rehabilitation, where he then conducted scientific work in the coal mines. Of course, Russia did commemorate Alexander Chavatsky, but it was a little too late. But his research spawned other studies. For example, Raymond Wheeler from the University of Kansas confirmed that the pattern, in fact, does span human history as far back as 2,500 years. He found that intense magnetic upswings directly affect the human brain and at times drove mankind into deadly emotional tantrums and frenzied killing sprees. He also wrote a book entitled Climate, the Key to Understanding Business Cycles. Edward Dewey found his information and statistically analyzed it. He is the founder of the Foundation for the Study of Cycles. Dewey validated the existence of these war cycles, and he described the 4 components of Chizevsky's 11-year cycle and their appropriate links. And this kind of illustrates the 4 cycles. The blue section, the yellow, the red, and the yellow again. Dewey wrote in 1970 that knowing that wars have a cyclical nature related to sunspot cycles implies that they have a common cause, and therefore they are predictable. If so, maybe they can be avoided. But for the powers that be, and their perspective on things, events can be staged.
People can be manipulated, especially if they're out of balance and out of alignment with their own truth. Dr. Robert Becker and Dr. Freedman also looked at this information and found that more people flip out at times of increased geomagnetic activity and that there was an increase in psychiatric hospital admissions. Now, Carol Moore has a website entitled Sunspots and Activist Strategy, and I'm going to read a quote that I feel is very pertinent to what we just discussed and also where we could be going. Governmental leaders often respond to mass protests by starting wars to unite the people and suppress dissent. Also, they themselves may get caught up in the mania caused by negative ionization and launch irrational wars. Activists since the 1960s, like myself, have lived through several sunspot heights. From 68 to 71, 79 to 82, 89 to 1992, and the 2000 to 2003 periods. We can look back at our own experiences of several years of frenzied activity with big meetings and big protests, when the least indignation might lead to riots, rebellions, revolutions, civil wars. And we can remember other periods of years where once vital organizations declined or died. Meetings and protests were fewer and smaller, and lethargic people seemed to be willing to endure repression. Then, just when few remaining activists were in deep despair, a magical resurgence of activity. If governmental intelligence agencies are on their toes, they have bookmarked this page, and they have experts studying the effects of sunspots on activism so they can squelch or even redirect such energies when they rise again. There are many examples of this. So it's hardly silly for activists also to look at the evidence that these cycles have influenced all of human history and to learn the implications of these cycles for activist organizing today and in the future. I've been talking to this guy over email for several years, and I feel that the work of Dr. Beryl Payne needs to reach a larger audience, and I'm hoping that through this presentation, more people will look at what Dr. Beryl Payne has been researching for several years, actually since the 1970s. Dr. Beryl Payne is a PhD in psychology and a master's in physics. In the 1980s, he found that the start of the warring behavior occurred on the ascent or the descent of the sunspot cycle, and that the physical mechanism to trigger this was changes to the Earth's geomagnetic field, which affects brain rhythms and hormone balance of sensitive individuals. This is an illustration of that concept. This is a chart that he created showing where you can see here the conflicts, some of the conflicts beginning before the solar activity. You can see here examples of conflicts beginning after the peak in solar activity. So Beryl Payne suggests that men have their own cycle. We know that women have a cycle that's connected to the moon. It's called PMS. And Beryl suggests that men that are out of balance may have their own cycle called MMS, or male macho syndrome. And he believes that during this point in time, through an increase in solar activity, solar energy, that men receive an increase in testosterone in their physical bodies. He writes, quote, "Wars could be called a mass psychosis or a new disease, which is not caused by bacteria or a virus. If warring behavior is perceived as a previously unknown type of mass psychosis, then the means for dealing with it becomes different than those traditionally employed. And those means have not worked very well." It gets even deeper in his book, Planetary Influences. He observed that when Mars, Venus, and Mercury were near the Earth at the same time period, more sunspot numbers were likely to form, and more wars were more likely to start if the sunspot cycle was either on the ascending or descending part of the 11-year solar cycle. And he found that there's a correlation 85% of the time between periods when planets are relatively near the Earth and the production of sunspots and other solar activity. There's also a quote from a famous metaphysical teacher called George Gurdjieff, who said in the 1940s that war is the result of planetary influences. So we're now going to go over the evidence, the historical events that have taken place in different solar cycles,
beginning in the late 18th century, around the time of the Revolutionary War. And we're going to have to abbreviate this for time, but what we can see in this particular chart, and there's many charts, it would take a half hour to get into all the things that took place between 1770 and 2013. But we saw events that led to the American Revolution in Sunspot cycle number 2. In Sunspot cycle 3, we see the American Revolution. We see the U.S. Constitution being written in the 3rd solar cycle. Solar cycle 5, Napoleon conquers Europe, 1803 to 1806. And a lot of other things taking place in Europe. Solar cycles 8 through 10. And we see events that led to the Civil War, for example, in the United States, which ironically started 2 years after the 1859 Carnarvon event, where the grid went down. The grid that did exist at that point in time. We also saw revolts beginning in India, Italy, and China. Solar cycles 11 through 13. U.S. labor strikes, revolts in Sudan, First Indian Congress meets. 1893 to 95, Zulu Revolt, Cuban Revolution. And we see events that led to World War I, solar cycles 14 through 16. And as I said earlier, solar cycle 14 was double peaked, as they're projecting that this current solar cycle could be double peaked, 2013 and 2015. 1914 to 1919, First World War, Irish and Indian revolts, Russian Revolution, and the atom split. In 1929, by the way, during the peak in sunspots, the peak of the solar activity, we saw the Great Depression. We saw the stock market crash, rather, that led to the bottoming out of the Great Depression around 1933. During the same time period, we see Mussolini and Hitler rising to power, built on economic unrest and other revolts, formation of the Red Army, more mass civil disobedience in India. Now we're looking at events that led to World War II, solar cycles 17 to 19. Spanish Civil War, Germany and Japan start World War II. Japanese rape of Nanking. Mass civil disobedience in India. U.S. still strike, 1947 to 1953. We see the Greek Civil War, Israeli-Arab War, India-Pakistan riots, Red Army wins China, Vietnam revolts, flying saucers start becoming more common throughout the United States. Following Project Paperclip, there's also a crash of a flying saucer in Roswell during the peak of that solar cycle. The CIA was created out of the OSS, and we saw the launch of the Korean War. And we see other events following that. The late 60s took place during solar maximum, solar cycle 20. 1967 to 1969. And by the way, these years that I'm reading, that's the years that we had the peak. It usually goes from 3 to 5 years. Each solar cycle, it varies. Sometimes it's short, sometimes it's a little bit longer. Height of the Vietnam War, peace demonstrations, worldwide student uprising, Czechoslovakian uprising, USSR invasions, in U.S. inner-city riots, Israeli-Arab War, Woodstock and height of hippie movement, uprising in France, Prague Spring, moon landing, MLK and Bobby Kennedy assassinated. And there's a lot more things that take place in the next cycle. For example, when Afghanistan was invaded by Russia, took place during solar cycle 21. The Iraq-Iran war began during that solar cycle. The Shah of Iran was overthrown. In the 1988 to 1992 period, we see a number of other events that are extremely historic. For example, the USSR begins to pull out from Afghanistan, and we see the staged collapse of the Soviet Union. We also saw the Tiananmen Square incident in China, and the Berlin Wall fell, the dissolution of the Soviet Union. Iraqi troops invade Kuwait. Bush Sr. gives New World Order speech. The Gulf War begins. We also saw the LA riots, all during solar cycle 22. In the next solar cycle 23, and there's a lot of things that started to kick off as we approach the millennium point in time. For example, the WTO protests in 1999, and other protests that were starting to increase at that point in time, and yet 9/11 hadn't even happened yet. But already the masses were reacting to these changes. that they were feeling in their bodies. We saw the worldwide Y2K scare. Heroin overdoses skyrocket in Portland. Bush is given the election by the Supreme Court. And the 2001 to 2003 period. September 11th, 2001. You'll have to use that typo there. So-called war on terrorism begins. Invasion of Afghanistan. Patriot Act signed into law. The invasion of Iraq. Because, again, these aren't wars. These are invasions. And, of course, mass protests against the war. Before they invaded Iraq, as we all remember, record numbers of protests, as well as afterwards. As we started going into the minimum, alternative media continued to expand, but protest numbers got smaller and smaller and smaller, obviously, especially after the so-called election of the last so-called president. So solar flex, 2001 to 2002. We can see from this chart that solar activity starts to ramp up right before 9/11 and continues to maintain its strength throughout the period of time where they invaded Afghanistan. And it starts to decline slightly in activity in 2002, but this is still the center of the maximum portion. We started going in the minimum phase around 2003, 2004. This is what we have seen in the last couple of years in this cycle, number 24. Descent in Tunisia, Egypt, Yemen, Bahrain, Saudi Arabia. Obama overthrows Libya. By the way, 8 years to the day that Bush attacked Iraq. Bush attacked Iraq March 19th, 2003. Libya was struck March 19th, 2011. And of course, we started to see media coverage of protests all over the world, not only in the Middle East, but Europe, China, and many other countries. And the United States, not limited to Occupy Wall Street. Also during this period, we saw Fukushima. In March of 2011, President Barack Obama signed the NDAA, Syrian Civil War. North Korea, the controlled wild card, points missiles at South Korea and threatens Hawaii and Japan. And of course, after the biggest solar flare this year, that took place on April 11th, 2013, we saw the Boston staged false flag bombing. Engineered at a specific point in the timeline, where people are most likely to react emotionally with fear to such an event. So there are also trends with economic cycles and the sun. And this chart was put together by Michael Manderville. And the arrows that I put here indicate the recession periods. So here we see on the left side of the screen, we see the Great Depression, which began during a solar peak. And we see other events, other recessions. This chart is 1986 to 2003. And we see the Bush Senior recession right here, and the dot-com bubble bursting right here. And when I looked at this chart, a couple things came to mind. Because during solar minimums, there's less human activity, or as Stravinsky calls it, human excitability. So when I saw that in 1913, there was a record low numbers of sunspots that occurred in that year. That was the year the Federal Reserve was created. If we look at 2008, that's when the banker bailout was initiated. Also a record low sunspot count year. Less activity, less expected response from human beings, less expected protests, more times to launch things when you don't want people to react to things that you launch. So they use the maximum cycle, and they also use the minimum. And notice how Occupy Wall Street took a couple of years to get moving after this 2008 launched the banker bailout scheme. In late 2011, sunspots increased, and that was around the same time period we saw an increase in protests and other things. So this has also been discussed by Forbes magazine, who published this headline in 2011. Riots, wild markets. Do space storms drive us mad? And believe it or not, we were just talking about the Federal Reserve. They quote a study that the Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta conducted in 2003, where they found that such storms could affect the stock market as traders were more likely to make pessimistic choices. Their report states that unusually high levels of geomagnetic activity have a negative and statistically and economically significant effect on the following week's stock returns for all U.S. stock market indexes. In addition to changes in the economy, cycles of war, there are changes that we see within the climate, even though this is not being admitted by the UN's IPCC, because it violates their official view of what's causing global warming. But here's an equation provided by Mitch Batros as to how sunspots affect the climate. Sunspots affect the solar flares, which affects the magnetic field, which affects shifting ocean and jet stream currents, which causes extreme weather and human disruption. This is a chart showing 400 years of sunspot observations. And during this period, we see what's called the, quote, little ice age, where there was very little sunspot activity. And so these are some of the charts that people refer to show that our climate has been changing for a very long time. There's documented pieces of evidence that show when there's less solar activity, temperatures on the planet are lower. NASA has confirmed the solar influence over the weather. This is from 2001, the sun's chilling impact on Earth. So even though they deny that the sun has an impact on temperatures and climate and other things, that's not stopping some scientists from saying that we can halt global warming or somehow be able to stop it if we start spraying particles into the air. Even though they've been doing this for years, chemtrailing, they're now bringing it out in the open, saying we could use geoengineering, reflect solar particles back to the sun, away from the Earth, and somehow that's going to make a difference. Yet they keep saying also that the sun has no impact on climate. So this isn't making very much sense. Chemtrails, as you all know, block our natural human connection with the sun, decreasing vitamin D in the body. And when that happens, you have more sickness, you have more illness, you have a decrease in the immune system. So there's been a number of earthquakes that we can also see during times where there's been an increase in solar activity, like Mount St. Helens, when it erupted in 1980. It was during a solar peak. The San Francisco earthquake, 1989, also during a solar peak. Hurricane Katrina, we saw a solar flare take place right before that occurrence. The Christchurch, New Zealand earthquake in 2011. Of course, Fukushima, Haiti, and many, many others. Of course, the earthquake in Chile is believed to have altered time and knocked the Earth slightly off of its axis. Now, back in 1996, there was a solar flare that ironically created a magnitude 11.3 earthquake on the surface of the sun. Now, we just had a major solar flare. It was only an M6 solar flare, but it was the largest of the year. And these are some of the things that took place in the last several weeks following that flare. A 7.2 earthquake in Japan, a 7.8 earthquake in Iran, a 6.6 earthquake in China, flooding in the Midwest and Chicago, and there's been also a few volcanic eruptions. And the biggest concern scientists have is the next big one. In my hometown of Portland, Oregon, even though I now live off the grid in Colorado, they're saying the next big one, which is long overdue, will be well above a 9.0 magnitude. When that happens, bridges are going down in Portland. It's not going to be the most sustainable place to be because there's massive reliance still on food coming from the outside to feed the city's population. So I'm very concerned about how the people of the Pacific Northwest that get stuck in the city are going to make it. If this, of course, takes place. But here's a quote from Jay Patton from OSU. If we don't see this event by 2060, we will have exceeded 85% of all the known intervals of earthquake recurrence in 10,000 years. Now, this is how Mitch Batros, and by the way, he's the author of a book called Solar Rain. He's done a lot of research into how these solar flares affect the Earth and create Earth-changing events. This is his equation. This is what his science has led to as to how this takes place. There are layers of the earth. There's the crust, the mantle, and there's the outer core, inner core. And then you have the core. An escalation of these charged particles, a deflation of magnetic fields, has a strong impact on the Earth's core. So the Earth's core is heating up. We talked about how the Earth's core is connected with the strength of the magnetic field. When that changes, the strength of the magnetic field changes. To compensate for the heat, the core releases liquid which filters through the inner and outer core as it penetrates into the mantle and forms large bubbles called mantle plumes. This is the process of convection, which is the transfer of heat either by circulation or movement. And it creates the bumping up of the tectonic plates, which can cause volcanic eruptions, earthquakes, and other earth-changing events. This is an illustration where he's also including cosmic rays as well as solar flares, and down the process, how all these things are connected. As above, so below. So there's a popular belief also that HAARP is the sole contributor, the sole reason why we see major earthquakes in different places in the planet. And I believe that there's evidence that suggests that in reality, HAARP is not the sole cause of all the earthquakes that we've been seeing, but HAARP in fact is using the magnetic field for not only mind control purposes, but attempts to control the weather and attempts to engineer earthquakes. And this is the prime example that I'm going to present. You can find many more on the internet. Was HAARP used after a solar flare to manufacture Fukushima? There are these HAARP floodgate magnetometers that you can find online. I'm sure you've all heard of them, where people say, oh my God, HAARP was used, I've got the evidence. And people are looking at these websites online that are showing spikes in HAARP. Well, there's a correlation between HAARP being used and the magnitude 9.0 earthquake. Yet, at the same time, here's from spaceweather.com, there was an X flare, an X1.5 flare, on March 9th, 2011. By the way, I was living in Portland at the time, and there was a crazy protest against the city of Portland's plan to merge the FBI and Portland police. And there were a lot of us that went there in a flash mob. We were very angry. We were very pissed off. We were not liking what was taking place in our city. And that protest also took place during the solar flare. There's a lot of information here, and I'm going to be getting more of this in a 130-page PDF that I want to release after this presentation. But I want to point out that there's also solar influence over the rise and fall of civilizations. And Maurice Cottrell has been doing a lot of research in this area for some time. There appears to be a correlation, according to the work of Maurice Cottrell, between the rise and fall of civilizations and the rise and fall of radiation from the sun. He put together the following charts, which illustrate a long-term envelope of sunspot activity deriving from the center graph carbon-14. More carbon-14 is absorbed in the growth rings of trees despite or during the solar minimum. Solar minima also correlates with many ice ages. The Mayans disappeared during a solar minimum. And he continues his research, which I'll get into in the PDF, that deals with how the sun's magnetic field reverses every 3,700 years. And when that happens, we get a rise and we get a fall of population rates. And this all deals with how the sun affects fertility. Solar activity has also been linked to genetic mutations, changes in the DNA. Increased sexual activity, as if that's a surprise. Increased energy in the body can lead to an increased libido and sexual desire of a variety of sorts, just like when we have more solar flares, we'll have a wide variety of emotions. Increase in sexual activity obviously leads to an increase in births. And there's many mythologies about the sun, many beliefs. Many ancient societies believe the sun is a goddess or fertility god. We have the Greeks that believe that Apollo was known as the sun god. Was the sun god. We have Shamash in ancient Mesopotamia and Amaterasu in Japan. The Egyptians believe that Ra was the sun god, and the Aztecs believe that human sacrifice was necessary to keep the sun moving through the sky. And the Hindus believe in a solar deity named Surya. In yoga today, sun salutations are practiced as a way to connect with the sun. There's also been many UFOs seen around the sun, which is interesting because we discovered magnetic portals connecting the sun to the Earth. So there may be a connection with certain phenomena, sunspots, and portals. And that's something that NASSIM HARAMEIN has been discussing in terms of ancient Mayan artifacts. There was also a giant sunspot right before Roswell that lasted several months. Solar flares are also believed to increase paranormal activity. And I can see many changes. You can read this, but I'm not going to get into it. Changes in my own life. When the solar cycle started, I had new ideas, a shift in consciousness, and I started to get involved in alternative media in 2003, 2004. But during the peak cycle of 1999, my life was very, very complicated. But the spiritual awakening that came with the Venus transit of 2004, literally to the day my life shifted after that alignment. Then I started to become more aware of my own personal life cycles. And so we can all ask ourselves, look at where we were at different points in the timeline, and see where we went through major changes, migrations, moves, relationship changes. And here we are, positioned at the dawn of sunspot cycle 24, which could begin anywhere from now to late 2013 to another peak in 2015, the Free Your Mind Conference in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. So the timing of this event, in conjunction with the full moon, I find to be very, very interesting. So solar cycles and arts, human creativity, new ideas, music, movies, trends, pop culture, so many different changes, be they positive or negative, that's all in the eye of the beholder and the level of consciousness of the people experiencing the changes on the earth. Now the powers that be give us the solar cycle by staging events, panics, wars. This is a really critical part of my presentation, which we have very little time for. But they do this to provoke a certain emotional response in human beings on Earth that are flooded with an excess level of energy in the human body. A sophisticated strategic use of problem reaction solution, launching certain projects forward during solar peaks and celestial events, based on the belief that their luck will be magnified. Moving certain goals forward, as I said earlier, during minimums, when they expect the least amount of resistance. Dark occultists behind the powers that be understand the makeup of the human body and our stress responses. Here's what's very interesting. On 9/11, at the specific time that the major events were being televised, the first plane hitting the tower, the second plane hitting the tower, the second building falling, then the first building falling. During those points, those times of the day, there were changes in the Earth's magnetic field, suggesting that human beings, through the emotion of fear, were somehow impacting the magnetic field. And you've heard from David Icke and others that they're feeding on our fear, these archonic forces. So if they know that when we respond to fear, we change the field this way, it gets very, very interesting. Here's something from NOAA and NASA that also confirms the magnetic flux on 9/11. The realities we have to face is that we're at different levels of our ability to be grounded and deal with this information, to deal with the energy coming in from the sun. And some people are more insusceptible than others. Some people just prefer to be controlled or control others. This is why we can't have a collective shift in consciousness as long as some people are still choosing to remain in a slave state of consciousness. Human beings that are out of alignment with their own truth are the most susceptible to having their perceptions and emotions used against them. So I think the remainder, the game plan for the remainder of the cycle is to continue to manufacture a civil war and prop up external threats and internal threats. And in terms of the manufactured civil war, we're looking at the gun issue that they're bringing out, pushing people against the wall, hoping people react emotionally. And I see a lot of that. A lot of people's Facebook posts, they're saying that they're ready for a revolution. They're putting themselves out there saying things they probably shouldn't say. Launch new proxy wars, conflicts, military interventions in Africa, Middle East, and Asia. The next solar cycle, the staging of World War III between China, Russia, and the United States, not until 2020. And there's a lot of quantitative information, and it doesn't mean that we can't change it, but there's a lot of quantitative information that they want to go in this direction. And my next documentary film is going to address that issue. How solar activity impacts human beings, chronobiology, is an overview. How we're affected by the sun, different hours of the day. But that's just the start. It gets deeper, much deeper. How solar activity impacts human beings. It's neutral. It's not good, bad, evil, positive, negative. It's energy. And how we are responding to that energy, it's different. We respond to this in different ways. The sun brings a cycle of birth and death, or creation and destruction. Solar flares affect the central nervous system, all brain activity, including the pineal gland, including equilibrium along with human behavior and all psychological, mental, emotional responses, and just about every other aspect of the body. New scientists have talked about it. Does the Earth's magnetic field cause suicides? And what's most interesting about it, there's also been lots of studies on how magnetic fields, natural ones and artificially created ones in labs, can cause changes in the brainwave state, can cause changes in our cells. But here's what's really interesting. The pineal gland, which is in the center of our consciousness, the center of our mind, has a concentration of magnetite. Magnetite was not discovered until 1992 in the human brain, but it was discovered in the 1960s in birds, fish, and other migratory animals. This is how we are connected to each other. The magnetite in our brain, that telepathic sixth sense. Evidence shows that magnetite is a transducer, linking ambient electromagnetic activity to cellular function. And in the pineal gland, there is a concentration of magnetic crystals. Study finds human eye also emits light, and that we have a sixth sense in our eyes. We're not aware of it consciously, but we're aware of it subconsciously. Now, there's a number of spiritual perspectives, we're obviously going to do this quickly, on how the energies from the sun come in and affect our cells. Purge energy, stored emotions in our body. This is why some people flip out that don't know how to naturally release the energy in a positive, mindful way. Manly P. Hall did a lot of research in this area and gave a presentation on the magnetic field around the human body and how our state of morality, what we do, you can even call it karma, affects the strength of our own magnetic field or aura. So what if solar activity is a catalyst for the travel of souls into the planet via new births, an exit from the planet via new wars? This is a holographic universe, as you've all heard, a spiritual biological video game where we each uniquely work to reach higher levels as we experience the nature of cause and effect in a physical reality. So this is what's important. We have to ground ourselves. Get engaged in exercises that lets you release that energy. Body movements that engage chi energy, like martial arts, dancing, qigong, yoga, being in nature. The body loves that. Traveling, camping. Creative applications of the mind, like writing, building new structures or homes. Creating art, music, documentary films, and it's very important to drink healthy water. And of course, healthy food. Several types of meditations that you can use, from deep breathing to relax yourself, to Vipassana meditation, which is observing your breath as it naturally is, becoming very aware and equanimous at the same time, sun gazing, and of course listening to certain tones and frequencies to bring the human body back into balance. And a grounding cord meditation, to ground yourself, not just breathe deep or observe your breath, but to practice in your mind, tightening your clairvoyant muscles, your ability to heal yourself. And this will help you with your creative and manifestation abilities. Together, we can use the mind's ability to affect change at certain points in the timeline. And there's a lot of evidence to suggest that we are more capable of manifestation during this particular point in time. That somehow or another, when we have peaks in solar activity, we are more easily able to shift things if we put our minds together selflessly on the same goal at the same time. During a solar peak, during a full moon. For those of you that have seen the film Dark City, that came out in 1998, the whole premise of the film was this man's journey to discover that he had powers. And the reason these archonic forces were attacking him is because there was something special about him. They wanted to know what made him tick. And he never prevailed over these parasitic, etheric, alien forces until he realized how to harness the power of his mind. And that's the purpose of all this information as we now close, that we need to harness the power of the mind strategically and not just react defensively to the changes that are taking place. And I believe and I suggest that we're in human form to learn how to develop those variabilities. And the real importance is what happens to our souls, where we go from here. Not being fixed and stuck in a fear or hope of what's going to happen in the physical realm, because there is a much larger picture that is far higher than what our brains or small brains can even conceive of, what could really be taking place in this holographic spiritual video game. And with that, I want to thank you.